podcast brought to you by thebuildphase.com, helping you build a better turn. My name is MrBen. Today's episode, Marvel Team Up. Episode 29 here on the Build Phase podcast, and oh man, we have something great today. I was able to get Danny Mandel on the phone, one of the two designers at Super Awesome Games who is responsible for Versus 2PCG, and we talk about Versus, old and new, the transition between the two games. We talk about the Thanos problem. We talk about the approach to plot twists and characters, and just, it's awesome. Feel super grateful that I was able to do this. Thanks again to Super Awesome Games and Danny specifically for taking the time to do this interview with me. And with that, here is my interview with Danny Mandel of Super Awesome Games. First of all, I want to say welcome to the Build Phase podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this interview. I want to start off with asking you what your background is as far as game design. What brought you to game design in general? And are there any cool stories about the origin of your company, Super Awesome Games?
Thanks for having me. First gaming experience, probably I don't know if you've heard of these game books called the Lone Wolf Adventures, where it's like a choose your own adventure.
All.
Yes, so you know what I'm talking about. Do you know that they have a website where all the books are now online just for free? You can play through all of them, including a bunch that never made it to the U.S.
I have the app on my phone, actually.
Oh, sure. Okay. I read the first 12, and then years later, I was at Walden Books or whatever, and I saw book 13, and I was like, "There's a book 13! What's happening?" But I was probably 7 or 8 when I first got the book and the Gray Star the Wizard books, all the little side books that Joe Dever wrote. Lone Wolf is awesome. That's what got me into games, and then from there it was Dungeons and Dragons, and then the usual. Ben, my partner, he's been designing games since he was 12, I think, and he made still maybe the best game ever that we've made, or he's made, is this game called, basically it's in a bucket of water. You play in a bucket of water, and there's ships, and when you sink a ship, you put a little weight on the ship, and it falls to the bottom of the bucket, and it's just hysterical. And so he's been designing games for a long time. We met in college. He would design a new game every couple of weeks, and we would be the playtesters. And that's where we're sort of we can just sort of design our own games. That's a cool option. And then I got pretty heavily into Magic, then led to me, playing in a lot of those kind of tournaments and meeting people and whatnot. And
what expansion?
My first Magic set was Tempest with Buyback, Shadow Creatures. That was the first tournament, the Sealed Deck tournament I was playing, and that was probably 1999 or so. Anyway, that led to me eventually getting a job at Upper Deck, and then Ben got a job at Upper Deck. I was doing the original Versus system, and Ben joined to work on the Quick Strike project, which was for the Avatar, the Last Airbender card game, and some other stuff. And then we ended up working together on the World of Warcraft trading card game. We went our separate ways for a while. I moved back out east, where we are now, to work at 38 Studios, which is a video game company. Then that company sort of famously around here crashed and burned. And then at that point, I had sort of dragged Ben out here, and then he and I decided to just do our own thing together in 2012. That's where we started, and it's been 4 years. Pretty good.
How deeply involved in the original Versus system were you? Were you in on the ground floor of that, or what was your role in working with that game?
I was one of the 4 original designers, along with Mike Hummel, Ed Fear, and Matt Hyra. We were all pretty raw at the time. I don't know that any of us had designed anything else previously. Yeah, there's a lot of stories from back then, but yeah, the gist of it was we put together the game. A lot of that was driven by making sure it feels different from what else is out there. Ideally, it would appeal to, at the time, Upper Deck was producing Yu-Gi-Oh! So we wanted to make sure there were mechanics that Yu-Gi-Oh! Players could age up into. And a lot of it was us just let's try this, let's do that. Lots of great ideas, but we were all pretty new, so we didn't necessarily understand a lot of the consequences of the choices we were making. I'll just give you a quick example. The stat curve in old Versus is very steep relative to the costs, right? At each cost point, the stats go up pretty sharply. And we were like, that's cool, let's do that. And our characters will have a different stat line from, Magic or some other card game, right? And it'll look different. But what we didn't realize in 2003, when we're all new at this, was that puts a lot of pressure on making your drops. Missing a drop is pretty bad in old Versus, right? You can just fall really far behind. And that led to us making more tutors, which led to more shuffling and players looking through their decks and making the game feel more scripted, because, you sort of always have the right drop at the right cost point. And it led to the teams that didn't have good tutors just sort of fell away. So there were all these ramifications that we were just like, well, let's do this for the stat curve, right? Which sounds really naive and was.
Just for anybody who's listening who didn't have a Magic background, tutors are search cards. They let you go through your deck, find a particular character at a cost, or find a location or something that you're looking for. Anyway, continue. Sorry.
So yeah, I worked on the original Versus for about a year and a half, I think. I was just one of the designers. Mike Hummel was the lead of the project. And then I was the lead design of the Green Lantern set, which was the 6th set, which was fun because I read a lot of Green Lantern comics during that period. And at that point, I moved on to work on the Quick Strike project and then eventually the WoW TCG project.
As an outsider, I have long suspected that resources were kind of siphoned away from old Versus to support the WoW TCG, and hearing that you moved from one to the other, is there any truth to that, or is that just me being bitter that I lost old Versus?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. Like I hate to say it, but like the sales of the projects have to drive how they allocate resources. That's not like we were designers. We just wanted to make cool stuff. You know, we weren't in charge of the size of the teams or whatnot. You know, and Versus was a very different animal at that point. Like the WoW TCG, well, a couple things. I was the lead of the WoW TCG project, and part of that was I learned a lot of lessons from Versus that I took to WoW. And really, I learned a lot of lessons on WoW that we took to new Versus. So in some ways, it's like a little circle. But in terms of resources, at that point, we worked a lot of hours on Versus that first year and a half. Like there were guys who were, including me, who were feeling kind of burnt out. Like it was just like set after set after set with like no downtime. To be frank, I was looking for a break and to work on a different project. You know, we were down the hall. It wasn't like, you know, we didn't interact. We didn't play test Versus once we moved off to another project. WoW came a few years later than Versus. At that point, I'd been off of Versus for a couple of years. Didn't really know like how big WoW would get. And part of that is just they had the loot cards, which were these scratch-off cards that you could get for your MMO character, but you could find it in the trading card game. There's a huge amount of like eyeballs on WoW relative to Versus, and so yeah, I'm sure I don't really remember the details, but I'm sure some resources got shifted around to that end. So you're not paranoid. I
definitely remember having like all this anger to the point where like I didn't play Blizzard video games for a while because I was so mad about the cancellation of the which. Now that I'm a 35-year-old man, sounds really ridiculous. But
no,
so you mentioned Green Lantern comics. Was that a function of working on Versus, or were you a comic book fan before that? Are you still a comic book fan?
I was and am a comic book fan. I grew up in the 80s. Like I was reading like tons of comics, mostly Marvel at the time. I mean, some of my best memories are like my parents would buy me 12-issue subscription. And we'd send it away, and then like 6 to 8 weeks later, I'd start getting my books, and then they'd come in these like poly bags eventually. And I'd come home from school and it'd be like, I got 2 comics today, you know, or I got 4 today. It's the greatest day of my life. No, I'm not going to come over and play basketball. Like so, yeah, I was a huge comic book reader. I still am, although it's different, right? Like there was a period where I wasn't reading a ton. Now it's all on my iPad. I don't read a lot of the mainstream comics as much anymore, outside of when we're like diving into a new set and I want to like get a refresher on like where these characters are. Also, at least with new Versus, you know, it's pretty obvious, but like there's more pressure to do sort of the movie characters. That's just like with Marvel's the company. Like movies are huge compared to the comics. So we go there for the purposes of being accessible. I was not much of a DC reader, but I remember that when we started doing Versus at Upper Deck, the original Versus, DC would send us every issue every month for like, I don't know, years. So suddenly we were getting like, you know, 25 books every month, and we would just sort of like share them around the office. So we became DC readers. And then for Green Lantern, I actually knew like almost nothing about Green Lantern. And when I was assigned to be the lead of the set, I bought every graphic novel I could find, and I like, you know, so I read a ton, and I got really deep into Green Lantern. Yeah, I guess that was a function of the assignment more than me just being a Green Lantern reader.
How about Aliens? Is that the same thing? Were you an Aliens fan before, or did you have to go watch the movies to make the cards? And I guess
I had seen the Aliens movies. I'd seen Predator. I liked them. They weren't this big. They weren't super important to my upbringing the way like Star Wars or Indiana Jones might be. When we were given, you know, basically when Jason Brenner from Upper Deck said, hey, we have this Marvel Legendary deck building game. We'd like to make an Aliens version. What do you guys think? And we're like, oh, that sounds cool. Then we watched the movies a ton of times. And I both like, now I know them a lot better, and I love the first 2 a lot. The third and fourth one, I appreciate some of the stuff. My favorite thing about the fourth one is that it was written by Joss Whedon, and it's like sort of that crew, that mercenary crew, is kind of the template for the Firefly crew. So you can see it, you can sort of point to similarities between a lot of the characters, and I just find that interesting. We researched the Aliens a lot to including some comics to design the board game, and then later the Versus set.
Knowing that you're not spoiling anything,
or saying that anything's confirmed here. Is there any specific character or IP that you would either really want to get your hands on or that you've, in your spare time, designed fun cards around?
Philosophically, there's sort of two things going on. Like, I want to just make a lot of Marvel sets just as a starter. Cause I feel like Marvel's the base of Versus. And back in the day, we got to do really deep dives on the characters because the sets were just a lot larger. Upper Deck plans to just keep making Marvel sets in perpetuity. In terms of other IPs, I really like doing new IPs, especially with the new Versus set, because we've really tried to put an emphasis on top-down design and the flavor of the characters when possible, and naming all the abilities. And when we get a new IP to work with, really no matter what it is, it's just fun to try to distill that IP down and figure out like what are the critical things. Like for Aliens, we knew like, okay, we have to do something different and off the wall with face huggers and then the eggs and stuff. We had to make that like a real core piece of what's going on. It's just really like, I don't want to say inspiring because that sounds really nerdy, but like having a new IP to work with is really fun. So Upper Deck has Crow and Big Trouble in Little China and obviously Predator and Firefly. So I just want to make cards for all of them, and I don't even know if some of them might not make sense as like a full set, so maybe it's like a little collector set that's really small or something. I'm not spoiling anything. A lot of this isn't even my call, although I will say Upper Deck is awesome. They first of all, the guys we work with are awesome, and Jason's an old friend. Bobby Johansson is actually the sort of one of our main contact people, and he's like an encyclopedia of knowledge about like all these different IPs. He often works with us about how about this character, how about that character, and like he's just great. So yeah, I don't know. In terms of a non-Upper Deck IP, it's kind of awkward to say because I'm like, either Upper Deck doesn't have the IP or like maybe they'll get it, but I don't want to. But I will say this:
you don't want to jinx it.
I don't want to jinx it. Well, no, I don't want to. If they're really in talks about it, I don't actually know IPs that.
Oh, okay.
Because we work for Upper Deck is one of our clients, but we no longer work directly for Upper Deck. So while we get some insights, we don't know. Like they have the big meetings about which IPs they're going to acquire and whatnot. It could just be awkward. But I will say this: even though Cryptozoic I think has the IP, I'd love to bring Green Lantern back to the new Versus set, just as my personal little, like, I miss you, Green Lantern. Maybe the stars will align and something like that will happen.
Well, Batman is the reason I got into Versus, so I would love to see DC again. To drill down on the Crow just a little bit, is that just the movies, or I guess we could even just say just the movie, because that second one was...
Right.
Or does that also dip into the multitudes of different comic books that have been published over the years?
I actually don't know which rights Upper Deck has. I know they have the rights to the first movie. We made a Crow board game for them, is just using the first movie. I don't know how expansive the rights go, and this is a similar question that for Aliens, like, what about the comic books?
Sure.
What about the novels? Like, it's always very specific to whatever deal Upper Deck and the licensor make.
I gotta say, I do really appreciate that with Aliens, you guys didn't use, well, with the exception of the one Queen alternate art, that you didn't use stills out of the movies.
Right.
Having a handful of cards that have half movie stills and half drawings would be just aesthetically displeasing, I think. I like the
style they went with. Also, a lot of the funny thing is for us, we don't see the finished art sometimes until the cards are printing. We see them maybe in progress. We'll talk to Bubby about like what an image should look like, especially when it's characters from the movie. We're like, yeah, do a picture of Hicks looking awesome, and then okay, the image came back, he looks awesome, or he looks terrible, or it's exciting for us to open the new cards when they finally arrive.
That's pretty cool. So as far as the new Versus game, what brought you guys to that? Did Upper Deck reach out to you? How long was this kind of being kicked around? Is there any cool anecdotes that you have about the genesis of the game we have today?
Basically, Jason Brenner worked at Upper Deck back when I was there from 2003. Ben and I were there in the mid to late 2000s. I don't know if he's still there, if he left and came back, but in any case, he's in charge of a lot of stuff there now. And I know he's wanted to bring back Versus in some form for a while. And then after we made the Aliens deck building game for them, it just sort of he talked to us one morning and was just like, hey, we're going to do a Predator deck building game. How do you guys feel about, we're going to bring back Versus? And, and he's like, obviously I worked on the original one, so he and I started talking about it. We talked about what the goals for the new game would be, and making it more accessible, which includes speeding up the gameplay, which things are sort of critical to the design, and which things we don't have to keep.
That point right there. Very next question I wanted to ask is if there were any things that were sacred to what made Versus what it was that you knew were never going to be on the table for being cut?
That was like the first question. It was, well, basically, I guess the first question was, is it going to be collectible or is it going to be the expandable format, which is what it ended up being. Brenner talked, we didn't really have a ton of insight into the sales side of Versus ever. So he talked to us about like, what this new game had to do for sales purposes, because without sales, there's no game, right? And definitely going to be the expandable format, which meant that changes a lot of stuff we can do. And there's some positives and there's some negatives with that. As designers, we just want the players to have fun. That's sort of where we always start with. We were very excited by the expandable format because it just meant everybody's going to have all the cards. Like, yay.
I love that, by the way. As a fan, I buy the one set, I get everything, as opposed to, like, when Marvel Evolution came out, I went to the secondary market, and instead of buying $500 worth of sealed, I just bought all the rares and things that I wanted, so that way I knew I was going to get it, which I'm sure hurt the bottom line. I'm sure that's what they didn't want, but I appreciate that decision very much, and I'm sure my wife does too, because I spend overall quite a bit less money per expansion.
Right, exactly. So I like the LCG model, like the Doomtown and the other games that have now sort of been reborn as much easier to acquire. The trick is that's way less lucrative for a company unless they get a lot more players to check it out, right? So this was, put an emphasis on accessibility, which of course we want to do anyway, but that was one of the main drivers. But to answer your question, we laid out old Versus and we sort of looked at all the pieces, and we said both sort of with optics, like what visibly is the most do people think of when they think of Versus, but also because I worked on the original, I knew why some of the original decisions were made, and including why some of them were just sort of made somewhat off the cuff. Like, okay, let's try this, right? And then that's how it ended up. So I had a pretty decent understanding of like what's going on under the hood. So some specific examples. Old Versus was superheroes and supervillains smashing into each other, right? We refer to it as like direct attacking. Mm-hmm. And there weren't a ton of games like that back in 2004. Shadow Fist sort of had some of that, I guess. Maybe mixing that up. Yu-Gi-Oh had characters just smashing into each other, right? Whereas a game like Magic, you attack the player and then they can choose to block or not, right? That's a different combat system. So, we're like, well, we want the action. We want superheroes smashing into each other. So we're definitely keeping that. There's also been other games since Versus, like WoW TCG, for example, and then later Hearthstone, that have shown that, like, yeah, you can just have guys smash each other. It changes the nature of the game. Magic, for example, tends toward ground stalls, and you have to put in mechanics that help alleviate the ground stalls, whereas a game like WoW TCG or Versus, like, tends toward favoring the offensive player, so you have to put in mechanics to help the defensive player, but that's all sort of specific. We looked at the 2 rows. We felt like the 2 rows were critical. It's a highly visible piece of Versus, and it's really fun. There's a lot of fun stuff the 2 rows offer you. I mean the 2 character rows. Obviously, there's a 3rd row in the back for resources. We looked at the resource row, where in old Versus, any card could be a resource, which I think Duel Masters came out right around when original Versus came out, and they also had a similar any card can be a resource. We looked at flipping over the card. Cards start face down and then they flip face up. We were never a fan of that. To dive right in, we felt that with original Versus, it was both sort of an ugly play pattern where like you have your hand, but you also have the sort of second hand hidden, and you have to kind of like look under your cards all the time like you're playing poker. Plus, there were under the hood ramifications of like you just have so many cards in old Versus. Like you have your grip, you have the sort of second hand underneath, so it made it hard for cards to have value, like discard effects and that kind of stuff. It was hard to sort of fight the other player on the cards in hand axis. We also didn't like that flip over a resource to use a plot twist, and then it's just sort of face up, sitting there on the board doing nothing for the rest of the game. Just sort of looks ugly. Like when someone sort of checks out the game in progress, it's sort of like, what's going on? There's just all this sort of noise. One thing we had learned for the WoW TCG was to do the opposite. Basically, we had the resources start face up as quests in that game, and then they would turn face down, so the board looks a lot cleaner as the game progresses. We also took quests, mostly just drew cards and like reloaded your hand. For the most part, they weren't super interacting with the board that much. And in any case, we felt that the playing plot twist from your resource row was not a critical piece of Versus. We felt like we could remove that. Others, like there's some big stuff, like this, like guys getting stunned. Felt like that was pretty cool. We wanted to retain that. How to do that? We also looked really hard at like the recovery phase and the 1 free recovery. On paper, I like that mechanic. It's like, okay, you get 1 free recovery, but ultimately the play patterns that it led to, where I can stun like 2 of your guys, but I only ever get like the second worst one off the board. It just isn't that fun. Like it felt like in terms of an action-packed game where guys are dying and new guys are showing up and whatever, it just didn't feel quite right for what we wanted to do for the new game. And then obviously there's the shared turn. We took a hard look at the shared turn, and there's some stuff I actually can't talk about because it might affect some future stuff. Like we do with pretty much any mechanic, especially at the engine level or the core rules, we always say, like, is it worth it? What is this mechanic giving us? Is it worth having to teach this new rule to the players? Is it doing something structurally important to the game? Is it doing something really fun for the game? So we looked really hard at the shared turn and like what it offered, and we felt that ultimately it does some cool stuff, but it really put a lot of time pressure on the formation step. And one of our major goals was to speed up the game, and not just speed up the game in terms of the total amount of minutes. Like, we feel like if you play a game for about 40, 45 minutes, when you're done, you're kind of tired. You're not necessarily going to play another game. But we feel like one of the strengths of a game where you're building your own deck is you can build lots of decks, and you want to try out all your decks, and maybe you want to change one of your decks after a game. And we put in all these main characters for you to build decks for. So we felt like we just wanted shorter games, such that like maybe the game takes 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then you play again, in an effort to speed up both the total game length and the pace of the game. Like, less time where like my opponent's doing something and I'm just sort of waiting. We really zeroed in on the formation step, and we were sort of looking at ways to just speed it up. And we still wanted it. Actually, at one point in one of our iterations, we didn't even have the formation step. Guys were sort of just locked in wherever you played them, and we felt that was too bad a feeling. That didn't last very long. But so in any case, we ended up cutting the shared turn. We felt like it wasn't critical to be what made versus tick. But these were our opinions. I know there are players online who are like, oh, that part is, without that, it's not versus anymore. So these are the judgment calls we made.
I am not quite that hardline, but the integrated turn was one of my favorite parts about the original game. However, I also take the point that it makes it really difficult to teach the game, or maybe not really difficult, but it's an additional hurdle to teach the game to a new person, particularly somebody who doesn't have a background in card games. That was always kind of a sticking point for me. So I hear what you're saying about streamlining it and is it worth it, but that was a cool part of the old game for sure.
I know. Well, we really dove in. We were like, what is it off? And I know Matt Hyra, I think it was his idea originally for the old game, and a big thing it offers, there's always this question of summoning sickness from magic is sort of the original one, but like you play a creature and then your opponent has a turn to react before you get to use that creature, right? Now the creature can still block, but basically there's this back and forth where you have some time to react. That was a core piece of the shared turn. The idea was like, well, I play my new guy, and we didn't want summoning sickness for versus. We wanted it to be like, you play your guy and you go right away, just like in Yu-Gi-Oh! And like, smash. However, we wanted to give the other player a chance to react to the new guy. So we were like, all right, I play my new guy, but I don't get to attack yet. You get to play your new guy. Then I get to attack, and then if there's any leftover guys, you get to attack back. That was the main reasoning for the shared turn, as I remember it, at least 12, 13 years ago. And we just felt that, come a long way since then, we felt like, it's actually okay. Play a guy, and he can just go attack, and then the other person can play a guy, and it's okay. We didn't feel like it was as critical to allow the other person a chance to like play their own guy before you got to use the character you just played. And we felt that a lot of times with old versus, the way you would sort of set up your formation defensively was mostly just to absorb the hit as best as you can, right? Because in the old game you have 50 endurance and you're taking breakthrough endurance loss, and you just want to like set up guys to reinforce and all this other stuff. And maybe you can protect an extra guy and he won't get stunned. But we just found that wasn't protecting your guys in such a way to just absorb how much like victory points you essentially lose. Just wasn't fun enough to warrant the other stuff, the offense and defensive formation steps we're doing for the game. So
okay.
I don't know if that's interesting, but
well, you've won me over. Like when I initially bought the Marvel Battle set and I read the rules, I was very resistant, but over time I see what the new game does, and I like it for what it is. I mean, here we are talking about it. I wouldn't be doing this if you hadn't won me over. You know what I mean?
Oh, great. That's true.
So you've mentioned several times that a big part of the game was accessibility. There are a lot of rules from the old game to the new game that were simplified, I'm assuming for that reason. Two things stick out, and that's range and flight. Both of these mechanics increased in complexity from old versus to new versus. Was there a specific reason why these mechanics and nothing else got more complex, or what happened there?
So we definitely felt that the two rows was the big sort of, this is versus. There are two rows. You've guys that flight, you have to fly, and you've guys that like can shoot from the back, right? And we felt that because we were removing a lot of the stuff that we considered not as critical, we felt that we could really focus on the two rows and make that juicier. So that was sort of a starting point. There were secondary goals, like we wanted range to matter more in new versus than it really did in the original game. In the old game, a lot of times it was like when you had initiative, you could sort of just bash with whoever you wanted. Range mattered a lot more when like they would go after you and they couldn't get to your range guy, and then he would get to strike back, on their turn. And even then, that only mattered sometimes. So we really wanted range to be a big piece of the the game, especially in a world where you're not sort of rearranging your formation on each player's turn. I felt like that was critical. That led to them, also thematically, that led to the defender doesn't get to shoot back, right? Because you're shooting at them, right? They're just sort of caught off guard or whatever. For a while, we went back and forth on whether or not the defending character would get to shoot back even if it had range. And then I don't remember the exact order of these things. A lot of, we talk about flowcharts a lot. We go down this path and that sort of unlocks this and it closes off that. One thing we learned was flyers, guys with flight didn't block other guys with flight. You could just sort of fly wherever you wanted when you had a guy with flight. And it became too hard to keep your main character alive in the last, for the last couple hits. It just, there was like nothing you could do. And then we were like, well, we do have this option of like, well, you play flight guys sort of defensively to, that unlocked the ability to make like grab effects, right? Like guys that just block flight but don't actually have flight. And then you could actually maybe protect your guys. And then we like the symmetry, like it's not exact symmetry, but we like the idea that like defensively guys with flight stop guys with flight, and defensively guys with range shoot back against guys with range. So we felt like, okay, but that's the specifics of how we got there. To answer your overall question, we felt like, let's say you have sort of game design points to spend, and if you spend too many, the game's too complicated. Felt like we'd earned enough points from other places where we streamlined that we could spend the extra points on flight and range.
I love that you put it that way. Taking equipment as an example, this was a mechanic from Old Versus that was not present in the game for the first 3 expansions, and then we got equipment with Aliens. Are there any other things? You mentioned how many different search cards you had to print in the original game. Are we likely to see something like search or the insanity mechanic or ongoing plot twists come back? Are there other mechanics that are going to be resurrected?
The short answer is yes. The things at play are basically we haven't made that many cards. Like the card pool is just a lot small. Like the pace of cards coming out is a lot shorter, or rather slower than what we could do back when we were making like 250 card sets and there were like commons and uncommons and rares. Originally we were like, yeah, we'll put equipment in, and then we just sort of didn't have room. And then we're like, okay, well, we'll bring back equipment when we have, and then we sort of realized like Predator and Aliens, that was a good sort of thematically a time to focus on equipment. So like right now, for example, you asked about ongoing plot twists, which are essentially, forget the name plot twists for just a second, but essentially they're a thing that does something when face up in your resource row. Theoretically, we could make in New Versus, we could make a plot twist that when it resolves, it goes to a place in the game and continues to have an effect, but we sort of already have that capability in different ways with just locations. We sort of drew a line there. There was never really that big a difference between a lot of the specific ongoing plot twists in Old Versus and the specific locations outside of the uniqueness rule for locations. That was always just sort of like a weird thing. But bottom line is we haven't really done anything yet with special resources. We've just sort of done basic resources, and we've done the sort of the wild resource that each team gets. And so that's a place where we're definitely going to add new stuff and screw around. I'm a huge fan of the insanity mechanic just on its face. It's challenging for the expandable card game format just for like sheer volume of cards. Like if we make a team, there might literally not be enough cards to build a deck for them if they have to be just one copy of each card.
I suppose we should say, for people who didn't play Old Versus, Insanity was a mechanic that came out for Arkham inmates where you could only have one copy of each card in your deck, so it was just pure chaos.
Yeah. And then I think there was a third example you gave, Insanity, ongoing plot twist.
On my notes to myself, what about Galactus or another team battle type character where I control one big overpowered character and I actually face off against 3 normal versus decks? Is that something you guys have talked about?
Well, we love that stuff. I feel like that's like the dessert. It in a lot of ways, like for the first set of the New Versus game, for example, we spent the majority of our time getting the engine together, like getting just like what are these rules, and then we did sort of the card pool on top, and in some ways that was the fun stuff at the end. With the later sets, there's a little bit of structural stuff. We're like, oh, how exactly are equipment going to work, and can you play them on your main character, and what happens if the character has multiple health, and does the equipment stick around, and all these kinds of questions. But for the most part, we're designing new stuff, and it's really fun. Doing alternate game modes, one versus many, or the dungeon decks from WoW TCG where it's like an automated enemy. We love that stuff. I don't want to speak to what plans there are yet, but I will say we love doing that kind of stuff.
Well, I will move forward a little bit. I want to drill down on plot twists. For anybody who didn't play the original Versus, plot twists had a number printed in the same location on the card as a resource cost on a character. You didn't spend resource points on the plot twists, but you couldn't play them until you controlled at least that many resources. It feels like, coming from the old game to the new game, doing away with that threshold mechanic turns plot twists on from turn 1, and it seems to have limited the overall power of the plot twist. So I kind of have a twofold question here. First of all, was this intentional? Do you see the role that plot twists play as deliberately being more subtle, or is it possible that because the game is so young that the more expensive, powerful plot twists were too many game design points? It added a level of complexity beyond what you thought should have been available in the rookie year of the game.
Got it. I guess I'd start by saying specifically the old threshold mechanic we talked about, we felt it wasn't doing enough work. And this is not something, Ben and I decided. Back when we were working on, back when I was working on old verses with the other guys, we all were like, yeah, Threshold isn't worth it. Once in a while, there'd be a card like Reign of Terror, which I think had like Threshold 4, and that mattered because you couldn't play it before turn 4. But for the most part, it was just a turn counter, and too often cards had Threshold 1 or Threshold 2, and that was ultimately that was even just like a referent. There were some cards that were like, interrupt the plot twist that has Threshold 1, but not one that has Threshold 2, and it was somewhat arbitrary. The Threshold mechanic in specific, we feel and felt that it isn't doing enough work to like you said, game design points to teach. That said, if we ever wanted to make a specific plot twist that were like, you can't play this before turn 5, or you can't play it until you have 5 resources, like we can just write that on the card. It doesn't have to have a systematic rule. It can just be that's a card specific rule or a keyword we could put on in the text box. It wasn't worth having a thing found on all plot twists, was our feeling. Now, to answer the other half of the question, which is how do we envision the role of plot twists in the game, this is very challenging. Specifically, we knew we were going to be playing them from hand, which means you're actually giving up a whole card. And we knew that one of the goals for new verses was that cards in hand should matter in a way that they never really mattered that much in old verses. That's maybe not fair, but we wanted it to matter more. We wanted it to be like, well, maybe I'm ahead on the board, but I've got fewer cards than you, so you're going to be able to turn the corner. Like we wanted back and forths, right? Not to just be a pure tempo game like old verses often could turn into. So figuring just how much value you got out of a plot twist was very tough. And I don't even want to say that we nailed it. Like we set it at a certain place, and there are certain plot twists that were like, yeah, we could have gone a little pushier with that one. And that one ended up being, maybe a little above where we wanted it or something. I don't. But this is part of the learning process. Like we're always going to, we know going into any sort of expandable game that we're going to make mistakes, especially in the base set developmentally. That's just the way it is. There's just not enough resources and time to test all the different things. But then we see the players get their hands on the cards, and we go, oh, okay, that makes sense. Now we learned that lesson. We learned that. We go, okay, well, yeah, we should probably charge a little less for that, charge a little more for that. And we adjust, right? Just like pretty much every card game. In terms of the flatness of the power level, because they don't have a cost on them, that's something that we are cognizant of, and we have plans for how to do more powerful plot twists. I'm not going to go into details now, but I will say that the very next set is going to have some examples of like, okay, these are more powerful plot twists. This is a way to do a costing system that's found on more than, just a few select cards that we feel actually matters. But I guess that's cryptic. I can't give out specific details yet.
It's exciting to know that it's in the pipeline. I'm glad to hear that, because I personally have felt that plot twists are, to use your word, kind of flat in these first 4 expansions. Let's move into balancing questions. Starting with the planning process, I'd like you to talk about the relationship between flavor and mechanics. Specifically, do you start with characters and then do the research and build mechanics around them, or do you come up with mechanic and then sort of find characters out of the Marvel IP that you've been given that fit with the mechanic that you wanted to do?
We start with flavor, which I think ideally is the better way. We prefer that way. Now we might choose characters because we go, oh, we can make a really cool card for him. We don't know what that card is yet. We know we can make a really cool card for so and so. But for the most part, we choose the characters that we think players would like. So there's actually a little mini anecdote here. The base set was actually originally themed around the Avengers versus X-Men storyline, and that's why there's characters like Hope Summers and Magic, the teleporter, are in there instead of like the more well-known characters like Nightcrawler. That's just a random side story for how those characters were selected. We start with the characters that we think are cool, or we think players will like, or the most well-known characters, and then we design from there. Now, one thing no one's really talked about this, but we've been doing differently with new verses is in old verses. First of all, there was like tons and tons of teams. I mean, there's already a bunch of teams in new verses, but there were like every step was 4 new teams in old verses, and each team would get a mechanic, often a mechanic that was very bottom up, very just sort of like, here's a cool mechanic, let's stick it on this team, and then we would design cards often around that mechanic, and then trying to capture the flavor of the individual characters, but that team had a very defined identity. And in original verses, a lot of times it was hard to play outside of team. It was sort of like, here's this team, and unless you have some specific mechanism, like you're just playing that team. With new verses, we actually designed more character first than team first. We're like, well, we want this card to feel like Beast, and we want this card to feel like Dr. Octopus, as opposed to being like, what's the Avengers theme, and then let's make sure that theme shows up. Now, certain sub-themes will appear, and we are cognizant of like, oh, okay, if we could go this way or that way, let's go this way because it might give that whole team a little bit more of a feel. But we really went character first. In terms of the planning process, for the most part, we start with a flavor. We design mechanics to fit those characters. However, mechanics get cut all the time. And not just because, like, they're bad. Sometimes they get cut because, like, we've come up with a better one for a character. So we just stockpile all the unused mechanics. Also, we tend to do this thing where we look at, like, here's a ton of different, like, inputs, and here's a ton of different outputs. And, like, here's some very specific cards we would like to make because we think it's very clean and simple and fun. But we just don't have a character that matches that design yet. But we don't try to force it. We just sort of wait until, like, okay, at some point this character will come out. Oh, this will be perfect for when we do Ripley or, you know, or whatever it is. It's a little bit of both, but we definitely start with flavor first. Now, occasionally there'll be a set like Aliens where there's all those, you know, more so thematically they're kind of the same, right? There's the queen, there's the egg, there's the facehugger, and then there's a bunch of just xenomorphs. So we felt like we had the opportunity there to make a lot of bottom-up designs where we just, oh, here's a mechanic we'd like to put on a card. Oh, it can go on him just fine, right? Or sometimes even development knob. Like we wanted the I forget what his name is, but the guy, we changed the names before the cards get printed. He's like 4/1 with leap.
The leaping xenomorph?
He's got 2 health, and we want, like, the leaping, yeah, I guess he's leaping xenomorph. A bit on the nose. But he was more like we wanted a little guy that could get to the back row and sort of cause trouble for the Cosmos, and, you know, of the world. So that you know, that was an opportunity to just we could put whatever we wanted on that picture. So we're like, okay, that'll be a bottom-up design. Bottom line is, we start with flavor.
So you mentioned Cosmo there, and I don't want to talk about Thanos quite yet, but he is one card that is kind of everywhere. And kind of in general, are there any cards that really surprised you that they ended up in every single deck at Gen Con, or because they ended up more terrible than you thought they were going to be based on your internal testing?
We learned a lot at that very first Gen Con tournament, and then in the sort of the weeks following. Like I said earlier, like there's definitely development mistakes, especially in a base set of a game. I sort of feel personally responsible for Cosmo because I wanted, one of my concerns about the engine, the new engine, was I wanted to make sure there were good utility back row characters. There had to be reasons to protect your characters. I didn't want everybody just being in the front row, or the only guys in the back row are just like ranged attackers. So I wanted to make sure there were guys worth protecting in the back row, and that we got, so we I think we got too pushy with the power level of, you know, Cosmo, you know, Yondu, you know, some other guys. So there's cards like that. One thing that we were very cognizant of going in was that old versus, like I mentioned, was very team-centric. Like what your team was determined what your deck could be, for the most part, outside of some team-up cards. And we felt that was a mistake, looking back, because it became very hard to mix and match cards from other teams, and mixing and matching is what makes deck building really fun, especially when we're putting all the cards in the same box. And here they are, right? We actually went the other way. We said we're going to be really open-ended. We have team attacks as like a primary driver towards wanting to have guys of the same team, and we have the plot twist mechanic where you have to have a matching symbol, and then we had some of the wild locations, right? But other than that, we're just sort of like, play whoever you want, try whatever combinations you want, go to town. And our reasoning was we felt we could start there, and then we can put in effect like, you know, Helmet Zemo that punish you for going off team, or Loyal Soldiers, which really reward you for going on team. So we felt like we could control it more from that direction. So that's where we are right now. But that a symptom of our choice is that you can splash guys. It's pretty easy to splash an individual guy, right? So if Cosmo is just this awesome utility guy, you know, then it's easy for him to show up in every deck. So that's something we are looking at in terms of approaches to future sets. But basically, how to address that sort of two ways, with the new cards as well as with both new cards and their splashability, as well as cards to encourage mono team play or discourage your opponent from playing, just splashing other cards. So I won't get into specifics.
There's going to be a big preamble on this question.
Okay.
Because KOing a main character is the win condition of the game, and main characters all have 5 or more hit points, that sets kind of a soft minimum turn number on every game. Yeah, there are edge cases like Gamora who can just end the game, but she still has to get to her level 2, and that takes a number of turns. Where I'm going with this is I'm a big fan of the rush type of deck, whether it's Magic, Hearthstone, Old Versus. I like being able to get really big characters out really early. And while I like having a 27/27 Megan on turn 3, all my friends quickly realized all they had to do was pack Yondu or some other answer to a 2-drop, and a lot of the decks that I was building didn't have that late game because I was going all in on the early game. And I've realized that aggro, in the way that I have thought about it from other games, doesn't pan out in this new Versus same way. So is it kind of unfair to this version of Versus to bring aggro, mid-range, and control definitions from other games to this game? And did you set out with the intent of pacing the game a certain way, or is this an artifact of the main character system?
Okay. I definitely don't think it's unfair. I maybe that's the wrong way of thinking about it. But just I think it's fair to try to start with what does aggro mean, what does mid-range mean, what does control, what does combo mean? And there's ramifications for all of these with the main character system, like you've talked about. We definitely put it in as a pace thing, but not as like a system-wide pace thing, if that makes sense. It was feel. Basically, we're like, well, how much value, how much of an impact on the board should a level 1 main character have? And how much impact on the board should a level 2 main character have? And how easy should it be to get far enough ahead that your opponent can't come back? Now, the notion of no matter how far ahead on the board you are, you can only do one wound to the opposing main character outside of a special effect is actually something Ben and I have been sort of tinkering around with for a long time in some other games, and just it's something we're interested in, because the notion of turnaround of like, well, you're ahead, but then I can come back, and then you're like, I think games that can allow for that are much more suspenseful and enjoyable. So we felt like, all right, that's kind of cool. You're putting a lot of pressure on me, but you can't just pound on me because like your draw came out a little faster than mine. Like I will have time to recover sort of automatically. We really like that, and then we tried to sort of look at that from the other angle and be like, oh well, and then we can put some heals in, and we can put some extra wounds in. We've been very stingy with ways to put extra wounds on main characters, but that's something we're learning about. The same way original Versus was very stingy with ways to cheat the resource system, right? Now, in terms of your example about like Megan or Yondu and whatnot, some of that is not the engine. Some of that is the actual cards that exist. For example, like is Yondu putting too much pressure on or Electro? People have been talking about. If there ever is like a really fast rush deck with 1s and 2s cost guys, like is the Electro just sort of shut that down? That's more metagame and what's available in the environment than the engine itself. But your question remains, like, yeah, like if let's say your opponent's not packing Yondu, maybe there isn't anything they can do about Megan when she's like a 27, right? From the design standpoint, or really we think design as making the cards and development and just sort of testing the cards. From the development standpoint, our goal is make lots of stuff, put lots of questions into the environment, like what do you do what can my opponent do if I have a 27, and then put in lots of answers, like, oh, Black Cat removes counters, and even Gods removes counters, and Yondu just stuns the character regardless of what their counters are. We just put in a bunch of questions, put in a bunch of answers, and let the players sort of have fun. And then when we sort of see where that shakes out, put in new questions and new answers in the next set. That's just been our approach. But in terms of the sort of the structural question you're asking, yeah, we didn't want games to be finishable on turn 3. We were just like, no, we want both players to be able to play until, at least turn 5 if the other player's hitting you every turn. And in some games, you can have 2 wounds on your first turn, right? If they hit you on turn 1, you recover on your turn, and then you trade with them. Some games can go very quickly based on player choice. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I was kind of the idea of ending a game on turn 3 is a mechanic that appeals to me from other games. But if Versus is being designed around not allowing that, well then, okay, aggro just means something different in this game.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to think about it. Like, it could mean you create a board presence that is really hard for your opponent to come back from. Like, that's still viable if they don't have the Yondu or they don't have the whatever the specific answer would be. I
think what it boils down to is creation of big early board presence leans pretty heavily on the generation of green counters, and +1/+1 counters are pretty fragile. There's a lot of answers for them. It feels like you make that big board and then Black Cat hits the table. And from that point, it's tough to recover if your opponent's been playing on curve and you've just been beefing up little guys. I don't know if that's a criticism necessarily. I was curious if this was more of an artifact of decisions made. You talked about flowcharts earlier. If it's like, well, we decided main characters need to have this hit points, and we realize that kind of neutralizes a turn 3 win condition. Or if you set out with the goal of, okay, we want to make sure games go at least this long. And it sounds like it's more, it grew out of other game decisions. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's very fair.
Okay, so the last thing I had about game balance, and we'll kind of go from this into the Thanos issue, is talking about formats. Old Versus had Golden, Silver, and Modern Age. If there's anybody who's not familiar with Magic formats or other card games, the age of cards made them playable in certain formats. So Modern would only be, say, the most recent year or 2 years of cards, whereas Golden would be everything that had ever been printed. I realize this game is still super new, and it's a little early to start talking about formats. The main reason I'm bringing it up, and I kind of like you to speak to it in general, but then also maybe mention whether this has been talked about as a way to neutralize the Thanos problem.
Okay. There's sort of two, in my mind, there's two big reasons to do format. One is solving a problem, like you mentioned. New players can be intimidated if there's, tons and tons of existing sets and cards. The metagame can get stale, where like, okay, these are the only decks we ever see. We've sort of established that these are the top decks of whatever the current environment is. And new formats, especially formats that sort of rotate away the older cards and bring in, just put the focus more on the new cards. That's sort of solving a problem about new player accessibility and then creating a fresher metagame. And I think that's important. I think that's something that card games pretty much need to do. I think when they need to do it, it depends on a lot of other factors. And fortunately, I think for new versus, I don't think it's that hard to catch up. Like there's been, 4 sets at this point that are out in the world. It's not, it's like $100. You know what I mean? Like it's not a giant imposition to start collecting the previous sets. And especially with like the internet now compared to like even 10 years ago, like there's so much help to, building your first deck and, all these things. Adjusting the metagame is still an issue, but the card pool is also relatively small relative to, old versus his first year. There's some weird things going on that are not necessarily applicable to a lot of other games. Like, for example, if a new card comes out in a set of Magic or some other game, and some dragon, and it's cool and it seems fun, there might just not be a home for it. There might not be a deck where he's good enough, and then he ends up not seeing a lot of play in tournaments. With new versus, each main character sort of is its own deck. It doesn't have to be, but it's perceived like that pretty standardly. So whenever we put out main characters, they're sort of often thought of on their own as a deck, and then compared to sort of not just the array of existing main characters, but just like sort of the top main characters. I should point out that this is speaking specifically through like the tournament lens. The game is made for tournaments, but also very much made for players at home to just have fun and build whatever decks they want and goof around, right? Getting back to the format question, formats are important to solve problems. I don't think it's super important at this point in the new game's history. However, there is another reason why formats are really great, and that's just they're fun. Basically, these aren't necessarily rotation-based formats, but just like, for example, I think someone ran a tournament a few months ago that was like street-level heroes. And it was specifically like you could only use like Luke Cage and Daredevil and Spider-Man and like Green Goblin, and like it so happened that a lot of these were not the main characters that weren't seeing a lot of tournament play otherwise, but also it was a good thematic reason to have a tournament. So formats like that where we go, okay, it's some weird format, and this is what's allowed and this is what's not allowed. I think that's just awesome. Basically, one thing we really like as designers is we want people to get to experience like the cards in different ways, right? Like in old versus there were limited formats where you could play field deck or draft, and you get to use a lot of cards that you otherwise wouldn't use. This expandable format doesn't lend itself to that as well. I mean, some people make cubes where you can sort of organize the cards and draft them. But for the most part, we just like new formats because it might mean new kinds of decks get built, and then even though it's the same cards, you get new experiences. We are huge fans of new formats, whether it's local store coming up with their own, or we don't think that rotation-based formats that's not something we're looking at the moment. I guess I can sort of segue into Thanos. Let's say the Thanos problem, he's this dominant thing. Let's say we already had rotation-based formats, and he showed up toward the end of a cycle and was about to rotate out anyway. Then I could see like, okay, cool, we'll just let him rotate out and we won't worry about it, and he'll be in the sort of the anything goes format, and if he's causing trouble there, we'll deal with it. We would never, I don't want to speak for everybody, but philosophically, Ben and I would never want to like create a new format system to specifically solve a problematic card, or put in a more general sense, if a card is causing problems, we want to fix the card or address that card specifically. We don't want to change like the game rules. For example, Goblin tokens from Goblin Queen trigger Thanos because they should trigger Thanos. That's the intuitive way they should work. Some people talk about, well, maybe don't have tokens work like that with Thanos. And we don't want to change the rules and what's intuitive and future cards that might interact with like the Goblin Queen tokens just to address Thanos. We'd rather just fix the problem with Thanos himself.
Confronting the elephant in the room head on.
Sure.
It sounds like you do consider Thanos to be a problem.
Yeah.
And then my follow-up is, do you feel like the Thanos card himself is the problem, or is his just dominance of the tournament scene an artifact of something else that's going on in the game mechanics?
I think it's the card, which maybe that's the more I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. I don't know what the artifact would be.
Well, I don't either, but I'm assuming you know more about the game than me, so I wanted to ask.
Yeah, that's very fair, very fair. Well, first, I can also give you some insight into how did this happen. During our development cycle, we have a certain amount of time, and we play test as much as we can, and we change a lot of cards all throughout. But it's not like at some point we're done changing cards and then we just play for another month. Like we're changing cards all the time. Thanos was unplayable. In a similar version to what he is now, he was unplayable in a lot of our testing. And toward the end, we were like, we gotta juice him. And there were different reasons why we didn't want to juice him in this way or that. But also the Guardians of the Galaxy, just as a random aside, they were the worst team. Like we had these different metrics for how to evaluate. We were going like cost by cost, plot twist by plot twist. We were looking at different aspects of each of the 4 teams. We felt like the Guardians were really weak, Thanos was really weak, some other cards, and we juiced him. I think Star-Lord, the main character, got juiced, and we went too far. That's what it boils down to. And it was funny because at one point we were trying to decide. And a lot of times in these games, you have to sort of make which way do we want to err? For example, different game, but in the deck building games we make, these are all cooperative sort of adventures that you go on. And there's times where we have to err on make it harder or make it easier. And we usually err on make it harder, because if it's too easy, it stops being fun. If it's too hard, it feels really good when you finally beat it. With Thanos, we basically said, well, he is the big bad guy of the Marvel Universe. Worst case scenario, if he ends up being, too powerful, at least it's him and it's not Gamora. Gamora is not the dominant character, I don't know if you remember, but old Versus, the Sentinels were one of the dominant decks, the New Brotherhood. But look, where are the X-Men? Where are the X-Men? It's silly, but the sort of popularity of the character sometimes drives some of our development decisions. And we went too far with Thanos. We ended up juicing him in multiple ways. It's so funny because Ben and I talk about it and we sort of someone want to punch the wall, but even though it's not the wall's fault. But we talk about the different things about Thanos. And it's not just that he's too powerful. It's not just that, when he does the Infinity Gauntlet, it's kind of a miserable play experience for the opponent. We don't even like the running your guys into their guys, suicide them to get XP. We were just sort of we talked about it, we're yeah, but guys are going to do that sometimes. And we're it's okay, they'll do it sometimes. And, maybe that makes us sound naive or whatever else. But the biggest problem was we lowered his XP cost. We were okay, if they suicide a few guys and whatever, it still takes so long to finally level them up, that by that point of the game, if that's your plan, so be it. And it's okay if he wins sometimes. But we just that was a big piece where we just dropped his XP cost, his level up cost too low.
What was it at before?
There were multiple variables. It was in flux, basically. It was 1 or 2 points higher at various times. But there were times where the Infinity Gauntlet didn't touch their hand. There was a time where it got 1 card out of their hand, and we felt like that was, we missed on Thanos. But also it got compounded by some cards that we made in the future, and we were already discussing Thanos, if and what to do about Thanos, before additional sets came out. And then obviously Goblin Queen, we knew that interaction was going to exist. We were we want to make Goblin Queen. We want to make it. There were a lot of little things that I had little tiny secret goals for new Versus that old Versus had a direction that we weren't supposed to make token characters, and we weren't supposed to put counters on guys, really. The idea was we don't want a lot of externals required. But because new Versus comes in a box and we can just give you all the materials, it's fine to make token characters. It's fine to use counters. So I've been doing that. I've been really enjoying these new sort of design veins. When we wanted to make Goblin Queen, we knew she could help Thanos, and we were sort of hoping that there'd be other powerful decks and could deal with it. But in any case, the answer is no. He is definitely a problem in multiple ways, and we are going to do something about him. I guess sort of I cannot go into the specifics of what that is, but I guess I can say this. A lot of people talk about errata-ing the card and just just change the level up number up by 1, or just change the text box on the Infinity Gauntlet to be this other thing. And I will sort of put forth what our philosophy is on errata, which is basically we don't power level errata. And this is not a new philosophy. This is sort of, I think a lot of companies do this. Basically, in our minds, our errata is to fix, I don't want to say functional problems, but the wording on a card, the template on a card, if it's not quite right. It's to fix typos like Hudson's missing the symbol. It's to fix that kind of stuff that it was supposed to do this, now it's going to do that. It's missing a thing. Or we updated the wordings on a lot of the triggers from the base set. It doesn't change any of the functionality, but if you go online, there's a slightly different wording for some of the cards. This is just learning about our own game and ways to make it better. So we're not going to power level errata Thanos. His power level is too high. He needs to just go. However, and it's funny because I also get emails the other way. Please don't ban Thanos. He's fun. I love him. He's a great villain. I get these board game geek emails. And one of the big benefits in our mind of the format where we put out the next set and here's all the cards is we can put a fixed version of cards into future sets. And there's precedent with this with other expandable games. It's very easy to do. That way we can keep him in some form in the environment, but we can fix his power level in a way that there's just a physical card that has the correct power level. So I guess I don't think I've spoiled too much.
Let me try to be clear here. Errata to you, it's something where we'd have to go outside the game. We'd have to look at the Google spreadsheet, say, to see that errata. But if a different version of Thanos is printed and then included, kind of like the way the foils for the Defender set were included with A-Force, that doesn't fall under the umbrella of errata?
Well, I mean, there's we could talk about like the philosophical definition of errata, or to me, I would think of printing a new Thanos as kind of like a ban and replace.
Oh, okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay.
Old Thanos banned, new Thanos exists. Now, you could just ban any card, right? Because we're just going to ban Thanos, and some tournaments are already doing that. Mm-hmm. So there's not a centralized, that upper deck itself has not done that yet, but, local tournaments, we do what your players want at, the local level, have fun, right? Like if Thanos is oppressive, we, as the designers, we know this. So get rid of Thanos, cool. From a casual player standpoint, and really the casual players are a larger percentage of the players than the tournament players, they might have no idea that Thanos might not be, busted and oppressive at their kitchen tables. He might just be another card. However, call it what it is. Like it's not great to ban cards. We don't want to do that. We would rather try to get the balance within the spectrum. Some cards are going to be more powerful, of course, because we have the luxury. Like if it were a trading card game where you're buying booster pack, there's no notion of like a ban replace. You don't just automatically get the new card, right? Like, and obviously you would have to buy the new set in an expandable game to get the new card, but we feel like that's a much lower barrier than just putting a new Thanos in like in random booster packs.
Yes.
Right? So that's basically where we're at philosophically about what to do about Thanos. What specifically he's going to look like when he comes back, I can't go into that.
Fair enough. To segue into tournament play, you mentioned that the casual player is a much larger percentage of the overall player base. Where does tournament level play fit into your design philosophy? When you are building the cards, I mean, I understand that the cards have to sell in order to keep making cards, and big money prizes are going to bring more people to a game. But for you personally, is the highly competitive space what you want your work to be best represented as, or is it kind of the wild card interactions that me and my daughter have at our kitchen table that really kind of inspires you? I know you said that was a nerdy word earlier, but is that what kind of inspires you to, make the next set?
It's the kitchen table. I mean, at the risk of sort of upsetting the tournament players who might even be the players who are more likely to be listening to this.
That's probably true.
Yeah. So here's where we're at, guys. We start with the kitchen table because it has to be fun. Like if it's not fun, I don't know. I've played collectible card games, trading card games of different kinds. And at some point, some of them start to feel like work. It's like, these are supposed to be fun. We make 16 main characters in the first set. At one point, we only had 8. And part of the reason we really wanted to go nuts with the main characters was we felt like it's a way to sort of add collectability to a non-collectible game. Like, I mean, you can collect each set, but, inside the base set, like, we could have just done like, all right, there's sort of 4 teams and here's your 4 decks, right? We wanted it to be like, no, there's 16 decks to start with before you start combining. So we just want players to have fun with it. We also know from a tournament standpoint, we knew the game was a high skill game. Like that was never an issue. Also, there were definitely players complaining that now new versus they took all the skill out of old versus, and it's not true. It's like, okay, if you want to go play for money, like you still will have an edge if you're a better player. Like we wanted to make it just this fun experience for casual players, for people who want to have a good time, while knowing that no matter what we do, there will be better decks and worse decks and a combination of people will discover and come up with and interactions, and that there can be a tournament game for it either way. Now, that was our philosophy going into it. It changes somewhat once there's a metagame. We know there's a metagame. We know these are the hotspots. These are the champions. We used to call them champions, but these are the main characters we missed on. They're too low powered. We take all that information going into the next set. We don't just make willy-nilly cards and go like, who cares if no one ever plays these in tournaments? We try to aim towards what we perceive as the correct power level. We also try to do weird stuff that doesn't necessarily have a precedent in a previous set, and thus is really hard for new players, or not new players, that's really hard for players to evaluate and sometimes hard for us to evaluate. The Warrant Officer Ripley, who can just sort of daze a character on her own side every turn, that's kind of new. What does that mean? What are the implications of that? And we sort of have our thoughts on it, but we wouldn't be surprised if some players come up with something that no one thought of. We know the tournament scene exists. We make cards with the tournament scene in mind in terms of balancing them, and occasionally some development stuff. Like, for example, like I said, that 4/1 alien, where like he's in there to like go mess up the little utility guys in the back row, right? Sometimes we do stuff like there's the alien plot twist that turns a location face down. Is that enough to slow down Thanos? No, it turned out it wasn't. Or isn't. But we were like, okay, that's a tool. That's a card that should exist. We're going to make it sooner than later because maybe that will help with the environment somewhat. So we do think about the metagame. We do read tons of stuff on the Facebook groups. We're keeping up with that stuff. But ultimately, we have to make the game just like, yay, it's fun, and look at this cool new thing, and look at that cool new thing for casual players.
I asked my daughter if there was something she wanted me to tell you, and her response was to say thank you 3 times for making a cool, fun Nico, or Sister Grimm. Sorry, she's a fan of the Runaways, so she calls her Nico.
Yes.
And I agree. That was one of my favorite characters that you guys have done. And she's not, I mean, I wouldn't say she's uncompetitive, but she's certainly not in the same tier as Thanos. While you were talking there, you mentioned the main characters where you missed the opposite direction of Thanos. Is there any discussion of a ban and replace strategy for some of the weaker main characters, or is that something that would be reserved for correcting a broken situation in the tournament space?
The current Thanos card is a problem, so that card just needs to go. That's the ban. Replace is semi-optional, but we want to replace him because he's still a cool character, and the overall concepts that he's playing around with are fine. It was just it's just the overall power level, right? The idea is he has a big, his back power requires all 4 resource types like that. We like that, but maybe the output doesn't need to be as strong as it is. When a character is weak, I'm going to use, let's use a character who's sort of forgot, like Captain America, right? No one's playing Captain America. And there's a couple reasons for that, right? Or there could be multiple reasons, but it might be that there's no team fit for him. It might be that he's too hard to level up. It might be that when he levels up, you just don't get enough value out of him, either in his stats or in what his back superpower can do, right? So these are all the kinds of things that we're like, oh yeah, we could have given him a few more stat points. So we could have made it so that his back power does this or whatever. Those kinds of misses, I was going to say, like, if it were a digital game, I'd press some buttons and I would like update him, right? Mm-hmm. As a designer, and I went through this, like I designed a lot of the original sets of the WoW TCG. I want every card to be good enough. And that's, somewhat silly, but especially for main characters, right? Like ideally they would all be good enough. There's no reason to ban him because he's not causing any problems. I think it's more likely that we would just make a new Captain America at some point who's either doing something different or is doing maybe something similar but better in the future. But so the idea of putting out new versions of existing main characters is definitely on the table. We want there to be a Captain America deck.
Would that take the shape of an Avengers-affiliated Captain America, or would a future Marvel set he say, I don't know what other team, but a different team affiliation Captain America? So you can play with that character, but it's not necessarily the Steve Rogers Avenger that showed up in the Marvel battle.
A lot of that comes down to partly circumstance, like what specific, what is Upper Deck looking at, or what we're looking at for whatever reason for teams in a given set. And a lot of that is, why not do both? But we don't have enough space to do both. Somebody points out something really funny. I'm struggling to remember the example, but there's like a character, I think like Doctor Strange is on the Defenders, but also the Avengers, right? And we chose the Sanctum Sanctorum to be the wild location for the Defenders, but the Avengers version of Doctor Strange can't use the Sanctum Sanctorum, and we're just like, yeah, that's kind of stupid. But it's a game. It's a game before it's realistic. We like putting characters on different teams because we just think that's kind of fun. Yes, there's definitely, like, it would be nice to have an MC Captain America on the Avengers who's awesome, in addition to maybe doing one on a different team at some point, right? So I don't know if I'm answering your question because I don't know which way we would go necessarily.
But it's all on the table, so to speak.
It's all on the table, yeah. Yeah.
With regards to the release schedule as it relates to Gen Con, I personally feel it kind of feels bad to put out new cards 3 days before the biggest tournament of the year. I understand that deck building under pressure, like in a sealed environment in Magic, is absolutely a skill set, and I'm not trying to diminish that. I personally prefer tournaments that pit the best deck pilots against each other in a known metagame, where the deck piloting is the emphasized skill as opposed to the deck building. Do you feel that releasing the games, or releasing the expansions right before Gen Con has a positive or negative impact on the overall scene? Just, I guess, what are your thoughts about that tournament structure?
I think you're right in multiple ways. yeah, I guess we've done it twice now. The first year, I thought it was kind of cool. It was like, yeah, it's like a party. Like, yay, we put out this new game, and like people are really excited and they can learn the game. They're also learning the rules to the game, which is a whole other level of complexity. And then they're learning the cards and they're building decks and like, wow, this is like a cool thing. I feel bad because I think some of those players maybe didn't enjoy their Gen Con as much because they were busy like testing and trying out the new game. But I feel like to a certain extent that was like a cool thing in general. I was not happy with last Gen Con because I felt, and Ben's on the same page as me, I've talked to the Upper Deck guys, for a couple of reasons. One, the same like pressure, you're like staying up all night, you're exhausted, but they're not playing at peak performance like you mentioned, and maybe they're not enjoying Gen Con because they spent 3 days testing or whatever for this one tournament. Also, the environment wasn't one new set. It was the 3 existing sets plus aliens. So it wasn't like, if anything, if you want to change the metagame, if you want to see the metagame evolve, which I think most people do, just generally because it's more fun, they need more time to play test with the new cards to see what, if any, impact they can have on the metagame. So I think it was a mistake. We're all sort of talking about, like, for next time, how better to approach it. There's different schools of thought because releasing the game at Gen Con is nice. So maybe it's just make sure the spoilers are available, earlier with enough time, or maybe just don't release Gen Con. Some of this stuff is definitely out of my domain of where I have feedback or understanding even, because it's marketing and then sales and whatnot. But yeah, I thought it was a mistake this time, and I was party to the mistake. It wasn't like I was innocent. I made a bad decision.
Okay, so to close out here, I just want to know if there's anything cool about Versus specifically that you can tell us about that's on the horizon, or if there's any, I know this isn't the only game you guys work on, if there's any other games you want to plug.
We do some other work for Upper Deck. We just put out the Firefly Legendary Encounters deck building game. We have the Crow board game that is coming out, I think, for Halloween, right around that. I don't know if that's official. Oh, maybe they'll yell at me. And then, there's one other game we do that's sort of funny to describe, but Ben is actually not here today because he's at PAX West sort of showing off this game, not out yet, but it's called Headhunters. Basically, if you imagine like a toy, imagine like a it's not a pop figure, but it's like sort of that size, but you can sort of take the top of the head off, and there's like cards and dice materials inside the head, and then you take those out, you put the head back on, and then you play like a one-on-one miniatures game where you're moving this toy around the table and like interacting with terrain and like blasting each other, and it's a pretty fun time. So if you check out PAX West content, you'll see Ben doing that kind of demos and stuff.
Well, that sounds cool. And I guess that's my list of questions. So I just want to say thanks again for doing the show. And I really appreciate the insight and kind of biting the bullet there with Thanos, specifically phrasing it that it is an error. A lot of times it's kind of mealy-mouthed, like, well, we don't know, we're looking at it. But that fills me with confidence that you guys are going to push us in the right direction, that you're willing to come out and call a spade, essentially.
I feel like we're all adults here. He's too powerful. Like, let's fix him. And thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
Awesome.
This has been the Build Phase Podcast. Remember to head on over to thebuildphase.com and leave a comment in the forums to enter into our drawing for 2 Old versus Hellboy life counters. My name is Mr. Ben. Go win some games.